Texas, 1882. Dust kicked up across the parched prairie as the last stagecoach of summer rolled into Redemption Springs. The small frontier town had seen better days, buildings weathered by sun and neglect, a single street cutting through like an afterthought of civilization in the wild expanse of West Texas. Daniel Sutton stood on the porch of his modest ranch house 5 miles outside of town, surveying land that stretched toward the horizon. At 25, he'd already lived enough for several lifetimes. The war had taken his father, the drought had nearly taken his cattle, and the loneliness of frontier life threatened to take whatever remained of his spirit. No sense dwelling on what cannot be changed, he muttered to himself, a mantra he'd repeated since burying his father 3 years prior. The neighboring ranches had all been bought up by Eastern money or abandoned to the elements. Daniel remained, convinced that a man needed nothing but his own 2 hands and determination to survive the frontier. Love was a luxury meant for safer places, cities back east where women wore fine dresses and men worried about business ledgers instead of water rights and cattle rustlers. Out here, attachment was dangerous. Everyone Daniel had ever loved had either died or abandoned him to this harsh, unforgiving land. His mother had returned to Philadelphia after his father's death, unable to bear another season of isolation. His brother had sought fortune in California, leaving Daniel the ranch and its mounting challenges. The West takes more than it gives, he would tell the ranch hands who occasionally worked his land. A man stands alone out here, or he doesn't stand at all. The cattle operation was small but sustainable, 30 head of longhorns, 2 working horses, and enough land to dream bigger if only the rains would come more consistently. Daniel had plans to expand, to prove that a man could carve something meaningful from this wilderness without risking his heart in the process. As the sun dipped low, painting the scrubland in shades of amber and gold, Daniel saddled his horse for the ride into town. Supplies needed restocking, and Redemption Springs telegraph office might have word from cattle buyers in San Antonio. The business of survival marched onward, leaving no room for sentimentality. What Daniel didn't know, as he rode toward town with the setting sun at his back, was that the stagecoach that had arrived earlier carried more than mail and merchandise. It carried a catalyst for change that would challenge everything he thought he knew about frontier life and the careful walls he'd built around his heart. Bethany O'Malley stepped down from the stagecoach, her 20-year-old legs stiff from the 3-day journey. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped during the jarring ride. The simple blue calico dress she wore had seen better days, much like the single carpetbag clutched in her gloved hand. "This is Redemption Springs, miss," the driver called down, already unloading mail sacks. End of the line. Bethany surveyed the dusty main street with a mixture of trepidation and determination. After the fire that had claimed her parents' boarding house in St. Louis, and her parents along with it, there was nothing left for her there but debts and painful memories. Her parents' only legacy was a name scrawled on a faded letter, Jeremiah O'Malley, her father's cousin, supposedly ranching somewhere near this very town. A distant relative was better than no relative at all, and hope was the only currency she had left. The lawyer who'd handled her parents' affairs had made it clear the creditors would take everything. The boarding house lot had been sold to cover some of the debts, leaving Bethany with just enough for the stagecoach fare and the clothes on her back. "Excuse me," she asked the station manager, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained whiskers. "Could you direct me to the ranch of Jeremiah O'Malley?" The man's bushy eyebrows rose. "O'Malley? Ain't heard that name in these parts for near 2 years now." 2 years. Bethany's heart sank. "But I have a letter. He wrote to my father from Redemption Springs." "Could be," the man said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "But O'Malley sold his place and moved on. Some say north, to Wyoming territory. Others heard tell he went to California." The news hit Bethany like a physical blow. Her last hope, her only plan, evaporated in an instant. She had $4.63 to her name, no relatives, no prospects, and night was falling on a town where she knew not a soul. "Is there a hotel?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Or a boarding house where I might stay while I figure things out?" "Widow Carson rents rooms above the Mercantile," the station manager offered, gesturing down the street. $2 a week, meals extra. $2. that would give her barely 2 weeks to find employment in a town that looked as though it barely supported the people already here. The weight of her situation pressed down, threatening to crush her careful composure. "Thank you," she managed, picking up her bag with as much dignity as she could muster. The mercantile was closed for the evening, but a side entrance led to a narrow staircase. At the top, a stern-faced woman listened to Bethany's situation with thinly veiled skepticism. "I can pay for the first week in advance," Bethany offered, reaching for her dwindling funds. "And after that?" Widow Carson asked, arms crossed over her substantial bosom. "I intend to find work immediately. I can cook, clean, sew. I helped my parents run a boarding house for years." Something in Bethany's straightforward determination must have softened the widow's suspicion. "Room at the end of the hall. Breakfast at 6, dinner at 7. No gentlemen callers, no liquor, no coming in after 9. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." The room was Spartan but clean, a narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a small window overlooking the main street. Bethany sank onto the thin mattress, allowing herself one moment of despair as the enormity of her situation washed over her. Then, with the practicality that had kept her going since the fire, she unpacked her meager possessions and made a plan. Tomorrow she would canvass every business in town. She would find work, any work that would allow her to survive until she could save enough for a ticket elsewhere, perhaps San Antonio or even Dallas, where a young woman might find proper employment. As darkness fell over Redemption Springs, Daniel Sutton tied his horse outside the saloon, the last stop on his rounds through town. Inside, the usual Saturday crowd of ranch hands, drifters, and townsfolk created a low hum of conversation punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. "Evening, Daniel," called Sam, the bartender. "Usual?" Daniel nodded, claiming a corner table that allowed him to watch the room while keeping his back to the wall, a habit formed during the turbulent post-war years when grudges often outlived the conflict itself. Sheriff Miller approached, coffee cup in hand rather than whiskey. The lawman was one of the few people Daniel considered something close to a friend, though even that relationship remained carefully distant. "Heard from the Wells Fargo man that cattle prices are holding steady in Fort Worth," the sheriff offered as he took a seat. "Thinking of driving your herd to market this year?" "Need to fatten them up first," Daniel replied. "Another month of grazing should do it." "You plan to handle the drive alone again?" Daniel shrugged. "Might hire the Jackson boys if they're available. Don't need much help for 30 head. Sutton Ranch could run 3 times that number if you'd take on a proper crew," the sheriff observed. "Your father had 6 hands working that land before the war." "My father had different ideas about ranching," Daniel replied, his tone closing the subject. The truth was more complicated. Expanding would mean depending on others, hiring men who might leave when times got tough, investing in relationships that inevitably led to disappointment. The current operation was manageable alone, and alone was safer. Their conversation drifted to local matters, water rights disputes between farmers and ranchers upstream, rumors of cattle rustlers working the county line, the arrival of the stagecoach that afternoon. "Brought mail and a single passenger," Sheriff Miller mentioned. "Young woman, by herself." Asked after Jeremiah O'Malley. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "O'Malley's been gone near 2 years. That's what has me concerned. Girl looks respectable, but she's clearly alone and without prospects. This town isn't always kind to women in desperate circumstances." Daniel took a slow sip of whiskey, recognizing the sheriff's implied question. "Not my concern, Sheriff." "Didn't say it was," Miller replied mildly. "Though your mother did take in strangers from time to time. The Sutton Ranch was known for its hospitality once." The comparison to his mother, her endless optimism that had ultimately been crushed by frontier realities, struck a nerve. And look where that got her. Back east, unable to face another day in this godforsaken place. The sheriff nodded, knowing better than to push further. "Just mentioning it." Widow Carson gave her a room for now. As Daniel rode home later that evening, the sheriff's words lingered uncomfortably in his mind. The ranch house felt particularly empty that night, the silence broken only by the distant howl of coyotes and the creak of the windmill turning in the gentle night breeze. Sunday morning dawned with unexpected clouds gathering on the horizon, a tantalizing promise of rain that might not materialize. Daniel was checking fence lines on the north pasture when he spotted a figure walking along the rutted trail that led from town. Even at a distance, the silhouette was unmistakably female, the shape of skirts billowing slightly in the strengthening breeze. Daniel frowned. Women rarely traveled the open range alone, especially on foot. Curiosity overcoming caution, he nudged his horse into a trot, intercepting the traveler before she reached the creek crossing. As he drew closer, recognition dawned. This must be the passenger the sheriff had mentioned, the woman seeking O'Malley. Bethany heard hoofbeats approaching and tensed, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake venturing out of town alone. The widow had mentioned that several ranches lay within walking distance, and Bethany had set out early, determined to inquire about work at each one. The rider approaching was young, much younger than she'd expected, and undeniably handsome despite the dust coating his clothes and the wariness in his expression. Straight-backed in the saddle, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm, he projected an aura of capability that belonged perfectly to this wild landscape. "Morning, ma'am," he called, tipping his hat politely as he reined his horse to a stop. "You're a fair piece from town." "Good morning," Bethany replied, summoning her most proper tone. "I was told there are ranches in this direction where I might inquire about employment." Daniel studied the young woman with unconcealed surprise. Her clothing was modest, but showed signs of long travel. Despite the dust on her hemline and the fatigue evident in her posture, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. Her honey-blonde hair was coming loose from its pins, catching the morning light in a way that momentarily distracted him. "Employment?" he repeated, uncertain he'd heard correctly. "What sort of position are you seeking?" "Cooking, cleaning, mending. I'm capable at household management," Bethany answered. "I arrived yesterday hoping to find my cousin, Jeremiah O'Malley, but I've learned he's no longer in the area." The pieces fell into place. "You're O'Malley's kin?" "I knew him slightly. He sold his place to the Hendersons about 2 years back." Hope flickered briefly in Bethany's eyes. "The Hendersons? Might they have information about where he went?" "They're gone too. Drought of 80 drove them out." Daniel hesitated, then asked the obvious question. "Do you have other connections in these parts, miss?" "O'Malley. Bethany O'Malley. And no, I have no other connections." She straightened her shoulders. "My parents recently passed, and I came west hoping to find family. Now I must find work instead." There was something in her forthright admission that struck Daniel. No tearful pleas or dramatic declarations of helplessness, just a simple statement of fact and determination to move forward. The sky darkened ominously behind her, and Daniel glanced up at the gathering clouds. "Storm's coming in fast. You shouldn't be out here when it hits." As if punctuating his words, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the prairie. Bethany looked over her shoulder at the approaching weather front, realizing her predicament. "I should return to town," she said, though the distance suddenly seemed much greater with the weather threatening. Daniel hesitated only briefly before making a decision that surprised even himself. "Town's too far with that storm bearing down. My ranch is just over that rise. You'd best wait it out there." Before she could respond, fat raindrops began spattering the dusty trail. Daniel extended his hand. "You'll have to ride double." Bethany had exactly 3 seconds to decide between propriety and practicality as the rain intensified. Choosing the latter, she grasped his outstretched hand and allowed herself to be pulled onto the horse behind him. "Hold on," Daniel instructed, turning the horse toward home as the sky opened up in earnest. By the time they reached the ranch house, both were soaked through. Daniel led her onto the covered porch just as lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a tremendous crack of thunder. "That was closer than comfortable," Daniel observed, pushing open the door. "Come in before you catch your death." The ranch house was modest but solid. 3 rooms with plain, serviceable furniture. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, currently cold and empty. "I'll get a fire started," Daniel said, moving efficiently to lay kindling. "There's a blanket on that chair if you want to shed your wet things." Bethany stood dripping on the plank floor, acutely aware of the impropriety of being alone with a strange man in his home. Yet there was nothing threatening in his manner, only a brisk practicality that matched her own. "I don't believe I caught your name, sir," she said, accepting the offered blanket. He glanced up from the fireplace. "Daniel Sutton. This is Sutton Ranch." As the fire began to catch, Daniel stepped back, suddenly aware of the unusual circumstance. A young, unmarried woman in his home, rain likely to continue for hours, and not another soul for miles. His mother would have known the proper protocols, but Daniel had lived alone so long that social niceties had faded from his routine. "I'll make some coffee," he said, moving to the small kitchen area. "There's a bedroom through that door if you want privacy to dry off." Bethany nodded gratefully and retreated to the indicated room. It was clearly Daniel's own, a narrow bed with a handmade quilt, a chest of drawers with a razor and comb laid out, a pair of worn boots tucked beneath a chair. She felt like an intruder in this private space, but gratefully used the opportunity to wring out her hair and drape her sodden outer garments over a chair. When she emerged wrapped in the blanket, Daniel had coffee brewing and had changed into dry clothes himself. "The rain's a blessing, even if the timing was poor for your walk," he observed, handing her a steaming cup. "We've needed it badly." "You have cattle?" Bethany asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. 30 head of longhorns. "Small operation, but it's mine." "You run it alone?" Daniel nodded. "Hire help when needed, but mostly it's just me." He hesitated, then added, "Had a few bad experiences with ranch hands who couldn't be relied on when things got tough." There was a story there, Bethany sensed, but didn't press. Instead, she asked about the area, the town, anything that might offer insight into her prospects. Daniel answered directly, without embellishment or false encouragement. The town was struggling, good jobs were scarce, and single women had few respectable options in frontier communities. The mercantile might need help, he offered. Or the hotel in Junction City, 20 miles east. More travelers there. "I see," Bethany said, disappointment evident despite her efforts to conceal it. Her meager funds wouldn't last long enough to establish herself in another town. "What made you come all this way on just the hope of finding a distant cousin?" Daniel asked, curiosity finally overcoming his usual reserve. Bethany looked into her coffee cup. "Hope was all I had left. Our boarding house in St. Louis burned down 3 months ago. My parents were inside." The simple statement carried the weight of tragedy without dramatics. "The debts exceeded what remained, so I sold everything and came west with just enough for the stage fare." Daniel studied her with new understanding. Tragedy and circumstance had forced her hand, yet there was no self-pity in her telling. Just facts, plainly stated. "I'm sorry about your family," he said. The words felt inadequate, but they were sincere. "Thank you." She managed a small smile. "I know the West is difficult, Mr. Sutton, but I'm not afraid of hard work. I just need an opportunity." The rain continued steadily, drumming on the roof and creating a cocoon of isolation around the ranch house. They talked as the afternoon wore on. Cautious exchanges that gradually revealed more of themselves than either had initially intended. Daniel found himself explaining how his father had built the ranch from nothing, how the war had changed everything, how he'd been rebuilding alone since his father's death. Bethany shared stories of the boarding house, of learning to manage accounts and difficult guests, of the plans she'd had before the fire changed everything. As evening approached, Daniel prepared a simple meal. Watching Bethany move naturally around his kitchen, helping without being asked, he was struck by how long it had been since he'd shared his table with anyone who wasn't a hired hand or passing neighbor. "The rain's letting up," he observed as they finished eating. "But it'll be dark soon. Not safe for you to walk back to town tonight." Bethany tensed slightly. "I wouldn't want to impose." "You can take my bed," Daniel said quickly. "I'll sleep out here by the fire. First thing tomorrow, I'll ride you back to town." The arrangement was improper by any social standard, but the frontier often required practical compromises. Bethany recognized the genuine respect in his offer and nodded her acceptance. "Thank you, Mr. Sutton. You've been very kind to a stranger." "Daniel," he corrected, surprising himself. "Mr. Sutton was my father." That night, lying in Daniel's bed surrounded by the unfamiliar scents of leather and pine soap, Bethany stared at the ceiling and considered her situation. The day had been a strange turning point. She'd set out looking for employment and found instead a temporary shelter and an unexpected connection. Daniel Sutton was unlike any man she'd met before, direct to the point of bluntness, yet there was an underlying decency to him that resonated with her own straightforward nature. He clearly valued his independence fiercely, yet had opened his home to her without hesitation when she needed help. In the main room, Daniel lay awake as well, listening to the occasional drip from the eaves as the storm passed. Having Bethany in his house had disrupted the careful isolation he'd maintained, yet he found himself not minding. Her presence filled spaces he hadn't realized were empty. Morning arrived with clear skies and the fresh-washed feeling that follows a good rain. Daniel had already been up for hours, tending to chores, when Bethany emerged from the bedroom. Her clothes dried but noticeably wrinkled. "I need to check the north pasture before I take you back," Daniel said over breakfast. Some of the younger calves might have been separated from their mothers in the storm. "Of course," Bethany replied, understanding ranch priorities. "Is there anything I can do to help around here while you're gone?" "To repay your hospitality." Daniel started to refuse, then reconsidered. "The place could use a proper cleaning, if you're of a mind to do it. Been a while since anyone but me has been inside." He left her with instructions about where to find supplies, then rode out to check his cattle. When he returned several hours later, he pulled up short at the site of his cabin. The windows gleamed in the sunlight. The porch had been swept clean, and smoke curled from the chimney where before there had been only cold ashes. Inside, the transformation was even more striking. Every surface had been scrubbed, the floors swept, his meager collection of dishes washed and arranged neatly. The scent of something savory filled the air. "Hope you don't mind," Bethany said, emerging from the kitchen area. "I found a ham bone in the cold box and made soup. There's fresh bread, too." Daniel stood in the doorway, momentarily speechless. The house hadn't looked this welcoming since his mother left. Even more disconcerting was how right Bethany looked, moving about his kitchen, as though she belonged there. "You didn't have to do all this," he finally managed. "I wanted to," she replied simply. "It feels good to be useful." They ate lunch together, and Daniel found himself reluctant to end the meal. Taking her back to town meant returning to solitude, to the empty house and silent evenings he'd convinced himself were preferable to the risk of connection. "We should get going if you're to reach town before dark," he said finally, the words coming out more abruptly than he'd intended. Bethany nodded, gathering her few belongings. As they rode double toward Redemption Springs, Daniel found himself noticing things he usually ignored: the wildflowers blooming after the rain, the way the late afternoon light gilded the landscape, the warmth of another person pressed against him in the saddle. At the edge of town, he drew rein. "I can let you down here if you prefer. Might be better for your reputation not to be seen riding in with a man." Bethany's light laugh surprised him. "Mr. Sutton, Daniel, I think my reputation can withstand being rescued from a rainstorm. But thank you for the consideration." He delivered her to the boarding house, awkwardly declining Widow Carson's invitation to stay for supper. As he turned to leave, Bethany followed him onto the porch. "Thank you again," she said. "For everything." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "It was nothing. Anyone would have done the same." "We both know that's not true." Her direct gaze made him look away first. "Goodbye, Daniel Sutton." He rode home in silence, the empty house greeting him like a rebuke. The soup Bethany had made still simmered on the stove, but somehow he had no appetite. 3 days passed, during which Daniel threw himself into ranch work with unusual intensity. He repaired fences that had needed attention for months, rode the full perimeter of his property twice, and spent hours calculating the potential profit from his upcoming cattle drive. Yet thoughts of Bethany intruded constantly. Had she found work? Was the widow treating her fairly? Would she leave for another town when her meager funds ran out? On the 4th day, he saddled his horse and rode to town, telling himself he needed supplies. The real reason became clear when he found himself walking past the mercantile twice, hoping for a glimpse of honey blonde hair. Sheriff Miller spotted him from across the street. "Looking for someone, Sutton?" Daniel scowled. "Just getting supplies. If you're wondering about Miss O'Malley, she's been helping at the schoolhouse," the sheriff offered, not bothering to hide his knowing smile. "Teacher's down with influenza, and the town council hired her temporary to keep the children occupied." Daniel nodded, trying to appear only casually interested. "Good. She was looking for work." "Temporary work," the sheriff emphasized. "Council can only pay her until the end of the month when the regular teacher returns. After that," he shrugged. The implications were clear. Without steady employment, Bethany would have to move on. Daniel completed his errands quickly, then found himself walking toward the small schoolhouse at the edge of town. Through the open windows, he could hear Bethany's voice reading aloud, clear and expressive, to what sounded like an attentive audience of children. He waited, leaning against a cottonwood tree, until the children streamed out at day's end. Bethany emerged last, looking tired but somehow more settled than when he'd last seen her. "Mr. Sutton," she said, genuinely surprised. "What brings you to town?" "Supplies," he answered, gesturing vaguely toward his saddlebags. "Heard you found work." "Yes, though only until Mrs. Peterson recovers." She smiled. "The children are wonderful. Some haven't had proper schooling in months." They walked slowly back toward the center of town, Bethany describing her temporary position while Daniel listened more intently than the subject might warrant. "Have you had supper?" he asked suddenly when they reached the boarding house. Bethany looked startled by the abrupt question. "Not yet. Widow Carson serves at 7. There's a decent restaurant at the hotel," Daniel said, the words coming out in a rush. "Not fancy, but the food's good. Would you? That is, I'd be honored if you'd join me." The invitation hung between them, awkward and unexpected. Daniel hadn't planned it, hadn't even realized he was going to ask until the words were out. Bethany studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "I'd like that very much." Dinner at the small hotel restaurant became the first of many meetings. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel found increasingly transparent reasons to visit town. Fences that needed supplies, messages that couldn't wait, business at the bank that suddenly seemed urgent. Each time, he sought out Bethany. They walked along the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse, sat on the church steps talking as the sun set, shared simple meals at the hotel restaurant. Daniel found himself telling her things he'd never voiced aloud. How he'd promised his dying father he would keep the ranch. How his mother's departure had felt like the ultimate betrayal. How the loneliness sometimes threatened to consume him. "Is that why you keep everyone at a distance?" Bethany asked one evening as they walked back to her boarding house. "Because you're afraid they'll leave too?" The question was too perceptive, too close to truths he rarely acknowledged even to himself. "It's simpler that way," he finally answered. "Out here, depending on others is a luxury few can afford. Yet no one truly survives alone," Bethany countered gently. "Even the most self-sufficient rancher needs community sometimes." As the end of the month approached, the reality of Bethany's situation pressed in. The regular teacher was recovering, and Bethany's temporary position would end in days. The knowledge hung over their conversations, unspoken but ever-present. One evening, as they sat on a bench outside the general store watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Daniel finally addressed it. "What will you do when the teaching job ends?" Bethany sighed. "I've been asking around town. The dressmaker might need help for the Harvest Festival, but that's only a few days' work. After that," she shrugged, "perhaps Junction City, as you suggested, or San Antonio, if I can save enough for the fair." The thought of her leaving created an unexpected hollow feeling in Daniel's chest. These past weeks had changed something fundamental in his carefully ordered existence. The isolation he'd once cultivated now felt like a burden rather than protection. "I need help at the ranch," he said suddenly. Bethany turned to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. "What kind of help?" "Cooking, cleaning, mending, all the things you said you could do." The words tumbled out faster now. "The cattle drive is coming up, and after that, I'll be expanding the herd. The house needs managing, and I'm away from sunrise to sunset most days." "You're offering me a position? As your housekeeper?" "Yes. Room and board plus wages." He named a figure that was generous by any standard. "You'd have the small cabin out back. It needs work, but it's solid. Complete privacy." Bethany was silent for a long moment, considering. "Why now? You've managed alone all this time." The question forced Daniel to confront motives he'd barely acknowledged to himself. Was this truly about needing household help, or was it about keeping her near? The answer was both, and the realization unsettled him. "Because you need work, and I need help," he said finally, choosing the safest explanation. "It's a practical arrangement for both of us." If Bethany recognized the evasion, she didn't press. "I'll consider it," she said. "But I should be clear about one thing, Daniel. I won't be treated as a servant. If I accept, it would be as an employee worthy of respect. I wouldn't have it any other way," he assured her. 2 days later, Bethany moved to Sutton Ranch. The small cabin behind the main house had indeed needed work, but Daniel had spent every spare moment making it habitable, replacing broken window glass, patching the roof, building a proper bed frame to replace the collapsed one. The arrangement quickly settled into a rhythm that suited them both. Bethany managed the house with quiet efficiency, transforming it from a mere shelter into a home. Meals appeared at regular times. The pantry stayed organized, and Daniel's clothing was mended and washed with care he hadn't experienced since childhood. For her part, Bethany found the work satisfying. The cabin gave her privacy and independence, while the ranch provided security she hadn't known since before her parents' deaths. Each morning, she rose early to prepare breakfast before Daniel headed out to work the cattle. Each evening, they shared supper in the main house, conversations growing increasingly comfortable and wide-ranging. The arrangement was entirely proper on the surface: employer and employee, separate dwellings, clear boundaries. Yet something deeper was developing beneath the practical exterior, something neither was quite ready to name. As preparation for the cattle drive intensified, Daniel hired the Jackson brothers, Tom and Matthew, to help move the herd to market. The young men camped near the corral, taking their meals at the main house with Daniel and Bethany. "Never seen the Sutton place looking so welcoming," Matthew commented during their first dinner together. "You've worked miracles, Miss O'Malley." Daniel noticed how the younger man's attention lingered on Bethany, how he offered to help clear the table, how he found reasons to engage her in conversation. A sharp, unexpected spike of jealousy caught Daniel off guard. "Early start tomorrow," he said abruptly, cutting off Matthew's animated story about last year's cattle drive. "We should turn in." That night, Daniel lay awake longer than usual, uncomfortable with the possessiveness he'd felt. Bethany wasn't his in any way beyond employment. She was free to form attachments with whomever she pleased. The thought brought no comfort. The cattle drive was scheduled to last 10 days, time enough to move the herd to the railroad at Fort Worth and return with supplies and payment. The morning of departure, Daniel found himself reluctant to leave in a way he'd never experienced before. "The ranch will be fine," Bethany assured him, handing over a packet of carefully prepared trail food. "I know what needs doing. It's not the ranch I'm worried about," Daniel admitted before he could stop himself. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the changing nature of their connection. "I'll be here when you return," Bethany said softly. Those words sustained Daniel through the dusty, exhausting days of the cattle drive. When thoughts of the ranch intruded during long hours in the saddle, it wasn't the land or the buildings he pictured, but Bethany moving through rooms he'd once considered merely functional. Spaces that now felt like home because she occupied them. The cattle brought a better price than expected, allowing Daniel to purchase additional supplies and still return with a healthy profit. The success should have been his primary focus, yet all he could think about was the journey home. On the 8th day, as they camped less than a day's ride from the ranch, Matthew Jackson approached him by the fire. "Been meaning to ask you something, Sutton," the younger man began. "About Miss O'Malley." Daniel tensed. "What about her?" "Well, I was wondering if you'd object to me calling on her proper-like when we get back." Matthew shifted nervously. "She's a fine woman, and I've been thinking of settling down. My uncle left me that piece of land over by the creek, and she's not available," Daniel interrupted, the words emerging before he'd fully formed the thought. Matthew looked confused. "Not available? Is she promised to someone already?" The question hung in the air between them. Daniel stared into the fire, suddenly confronted with feelings he'd been carefully avoiding. Was Bethany promised? No. Was she free to receive courtship from a decent young rancher like Matthew Jackson? By all rights, yes. Yet the thought of her forming an attachment to anyone else, of her leaving Sutton Ranch to make a home elsewhere, created a hollow feeling Daniel couldn't ignore. "I apologize," he said finally. "It's not my place to speak for her. You should ask Miss O'Malley directly when we return." Matthew nodded, though he eyed Daniel with new speculation. "I intend to, unless there's some other reason you think I shouldn't." It was a direct challenge, forcing Daniel to either claim some interest in Bethany or admit he had no right to interfere. The moment stretched, taut with unspoken implications. "No reason," Daniel finally said, the words feeling like gravel in his throat. They reached the ranch the following evening, earlier than expected. The house glowed with warm light against the gathering dusk, smoke curling invitingly from the chimney. It was a homecoming unlike any Daniel had experienced before, not just returning to property, but to someone who waited. Bethany emerged onto the porch at the sound of hoofbeats, a smile blooming across her face that made Daniel's heart stutter in his chest. For one suspended moment, as he dismounted and crossed to the porch, everything else fell away. The Jacksons, the cattle, the profits, all secondary to the simple fact of her presence. "Welcome back," she said, genuine warmth in her voice. "You're earlier than expected." "Good weather and fair prices," Daniel replied, suddenly aware of the trail dust coating his clothes and skin. "Everything all right here?" "Perfect," she assured him. "Supper's nearly ready, and there's hot water for washing up." The evening unfolded with comfortable familiarity. A good meal, conversation about the drive and ranch matters, the Jacksons contributing stories that had Bethany laughing in a way that brightened the whole room. Daniel watched Matthew's attentiveness to Bethany with growing unease. The younger man helped clear dishes, complimented her cooking with excessive enthusiasm, and positioned himself beside her at every opportunity. When the Jacksons finally departed for their camp by the corral, Daniel lingered in the kitchen where Bethany was finishing the washing up. "Matthew Jackson seems quite taken with you," he observed, attempting a casual tone that fell decidedly short. Bethany glanced at him, a slight smile playing at her lips. "He's been very polite. He mentioned he might call on you." Formally, the words felt like pebbles in Daniel's mouth. "Did he?" Bethany turned fully to face him, drying her hands on her apron. "And what did you tell him?" "That it wasn't my place to speak for you." Daniel hesitated, then forced himself to continue. "He's a good man. Hardworking. Has land of his own starting up." Bethany studied him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. "Are you encouraging this courtship, Daniel?" It was a direct question with no room for evasion. Daniel found himself at a crossroads. Continue the safe, controlled isolation he'd maintained for years, or risk acknowledging the feelings that had been developing since Bethany arrived. "No," he said finally, the single word carrying the weight of confession. "I'm not." Bethany's eyes softened. "Why not?" The question hung between them, demanding honesty Daniel wasn't sure he was capable of giving. The walls he'd built around his heart had protected him for so long that dismantling them, even brick by brick, felt like exposing himself to unbearable vulnerability. "It's late," he said instead, retreating to safer ground. "We should both get some rest." Disappointment flickered across Bethany's face before she composed her features. "Of course. Good night, Daniel." He watched her walk to her cabin, the distance between them suddenly feeling vast despite the few physical yards separating their dwellings. The next morning, Daniel rose before dawn, determined to lose himself in ranch work rather than confront the uncomfortable emotions stirring within. He avoided the main house until mid-morning, when hunger finally drove him back. He found the Jacksons already there, enjoying coffee at the kitchen table while Bethany kneaded bread dough. The domestic scene, his kitchen, his employee, his hired hands, struck him as simultaneously right and wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. "Matthew was just telling me about his plans for his uncle's land," Bethany said as Daniel entered. "It sounds promising." Daniel nodded stiffly, pouring himself coffee. "Jackson land has good water access. Miss O'Malley's agreed to accompany me to the Harvest Festival in town next Saturday," Matthew announced, pride evident in his voice. "If that meets with your approval, Sutton, since she's in your employ." The statement, framed as a courtesy but delivered as a challenge, hung in the air between them. Daniel felt 3 pairs of eyes waiting for his response. "Miss O'Malley's time is her own when not performing household duties," he managed, the words tasting like ash. Bethany's gaze remained fixed on him, as though waiting for something more. When nothing came, she turned back to her bread dough, her movements more forceful than necessary. "We should check the south pasture fencing," Daniel said to the Jacksons, desperate to escape the suddenly oppressive kitchen. Some of the younger stock were pushing at the boundaries before the drive. The next few days passed in strained politeness. Daniel extended the Jacksons' employment, finding tasks that kept them, and himself, away from the main house for most of daylight hours. Meals became perfunctory affairs, the easy conversation of before replaced by careful formality. Bethany maintained her duties with unwavering efficiency, but the warmth that had characterized their interactions dimmed noticeably. She answered when spoken to, prepared meals with the same care as always, kept the house in perfect order. Yet something essential had withdrawn, as though she'd placed her true self behind glass, visible but untouchable. The approaching harvest festival occupied the town's attention. Decorations appeared along the main street, merchants stocked special goods, and a dance platform was erected in the town square. In years past, Daniel had largely ignored such celebrations, making only the briefest appearance required by community standards. This year, however, the festival loomed in his thoughts with uncomfortable prominence. The image of Bethany accompanying Matthew Jackson, dancing, laughing, perhaps forming a connection that could lead to courtship and eventually marriage, created a hollow feeling in his chest that no amount of ranch work could fill. 3 days before the festival, Daniel rode into town on the pretext of banking business. His real purpose became clear when he found himself outside the dressmaker's shop, staring at a blue silk ribbon displayed in the window. Without allowing himself to overthink, he entered the shop and purchased it, along with a small silver hair comb the shopkeeper suggested would complement the ribbon beautifully. That evening, after the Jacksons had departed for their own camp, Daniel approached Bethany as she prepared to return to her cabin. "I brought something for you," he said, awkwardly producing the small package. "For the festival, if you'd like it." Bethany's surprise was evident as she unwrapped the tissue paper, revealing the ribbon and comb nestled within. "Daniel, these are beautiful. Blue suits you," he said simply. "Matches your eyes." The comment, more personal than any he'd offered before, hung between them like a tentative bridge across the distance that had grown. "Thank you," Bethany said softly. "It's been a long while since anyone gave me a gift." Daniel nodded, suddenly unsure what to say next. The words he needed seemed trapped behind the walls he'd built, walls that had kept him safe, but isolated for too long. "Will you be attending the festival?" Bethany asked, filling the silence. "I hadn't planned to," Daniel admitted. "Not much for town celebrations." Disappointment flickered briefly across her face before she composed her features. "Of course. Well, thank you again for the ribbon. Good night, Daniel." He watched her walk to her cabin, the small package clutched carefully in her hands, and felt as though something important had slipped through his fingers. The night of the harvest festival arrived with perfect autumn weather, cool enough for jackets, but clear and dry. Daniel found himself restless, pacing the ranch house as twilight descended. Through the window, he could see light in Bethany's cabin, shadows moving as she prepared for her evening with Matthew Jackson. The thought of her dressed in her best, wearing the ribbon he'd given her, but accompanying another man, created a discomfort he could no longer ignore. The careful walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling, whether he willed it or not. When Matthew arrived, dressed in his Sunday best with his hair slicked down, Daniel retreated to the porch, unwilling to watch their departure, yet unable to tear himself away completely. Bethany emerged from her cabin wearing her blue dress, freshly pressed and adorned with subtle embellishments she must have added herself. The ribbon Daniel had given her was woven through her honey blonde hair, which had been arranged in an elegant style that framed her face beautifully. The silver comb caught the last light of day, sparkling like a star against her golden hair. She was breathtaking. Matthew clearly thought so too, his admiration evident even from a distance as he helped her into the wagon he'd brought. They departed in a cloud of dust, leaving Daniel alone with thoughts he could no longer outrun. The ranch house felt emptier than ever as night fully descended. Daniel lit the lamps, tried to review cattle records, attempted to focus on plans for using the profits from the recent sale. Nothing held his attention. The truth he'd been avoiding settled over him with undeniable clarity. In the short time since Bethany had arrived, she had become essential to his happiness in ways that transcended her role as housekeeper. The prospect of her forming an attachment to Matthew Jackson, or anyone else, was unbearable not because he would lose household help, but because he would lose her. Daniel Sutton, who had convinced himself that isolation was strength and attachment was weakness, had committed the very act he'd sworn to avoid. He had fallen in love. The realization propelled him to his feet. If there was even the slightest chance that Bethany might return his feelings, he couldn't remain silent while another man courted her. Pride and fear had kept him from speaking honestly before, but now those seemed like poor excuses for risking a lifetime of regret. Without allowing himself time for second thoughts, Daniel saddled his horse and rode toward town, urged by a sense of urgency he'd rarely felt before. Redemption Springs glowed with more lights than usual, lanterns strung between buildings creating pools of warmth in the autumn night. The music from the town square could be heard from a distance. Fiddles, a guitar, the steady rhythm of boots on wooden boards as dancers moved through familiar patterns. Daniel tied his horse at the edge of the gathering, suddenly aware of his work clothes and unplanned appearance. Townsfolk nodded greetings as he moved through the crowd, searching for a glimpse of honey-blonde hair and blue ribbon. He found them near the dance platform, where Matthew was leading Bethany through a lively reel. She was smiling, her cheeks flushed with exertion, the ribbon in her hair catching the lamplight as she turned. The sight stopped Daniel in his tracks, doubt suddenly flooding back. What right did he have to interfere? Bethany deserved happiness, security, a man unafraid to offer his heart openly. Matthew Jackson was young, prosperous, without the shadows that haunted Daniel's past. Perhaps this was for the best. As the dance ended, Bethany spotted him standing at the edge of the crowd. Surprise registered on her face, followed by something less easily defined. Confusion, perhaps, or hope. She said something to Matthew, who turned to look at Daniel with obvious displeasure. Before either could approach, Sheriff Miller appeared at Daniel's side. "Didn't expect to see you here, Sutton. Not usually one for town gatherings." "Had business to attend to," Daniel replied, unable to tear his gaze from Bethany, who was now making her way toward him with Matthew following close behind. "Daniel," she said when she reached him, slightly breathless from dancing. "I didn't think you were coming." "Changed my mind," he answered simply, suddenly at a loss for the words he'd rehearsed on the ride to town. "Sutton," Matthew acknowledged stiffly. "Something wrong at the ranch?" "No," Daniel said. "I need to speak with Miss O'Malley. Privately." The request hung in the air between them, charged with implication. Matthew's posture stiffened noticeably. "Miss O'Malley is my guest for the evening," he said. "Whatever ranch business you have can surely wait until tomorrow." "It's not ranch business," Daniel replied, his gaze fixed on Bethany. "And it can't wait." Bethany looked between the two men, aware of the tension building. "Perhaps we could step away for just a moment," she suggested to Matthew. "I'm sure it won't take long." Matthew clearly wanted to object, but recognized the determination in Bethany's expression. "I'll wait by the refreshment table," he said finally, moving away with obvious reluctance. Daniel led Bethany to a quieter area near the church, away from the immediate press of the celebration, but still within sight of others, maintaining propriety while allowing for privacy. "What's so urgent?" Bethany asked once they were alone. "Has something happened?" Now that the moment had arrived, Daniel found himself struggling for words. How did one dismantle years of careful isolation in a single conversation? "The ribbon suits you," he said finally. "I'm glad you wore it." Bethany's hand went to her hair, touching the blue silk lightly. "It was a thoughtful gift. But I don't think you rode all the way to town to tell me that." "No," Daniel admitted. He took a deep breath, then plunged ahead. "I came because I couldn't bear the thought of you spending the evening with Matthew Jackson without knowing the truth." "What truth?" Bethany's voice was barely above a whisper. "That I've been a fool," Daniel said simply. "That I've spent years convincing myself I was better off alone, safer without attachments. That I believed letting people close only led to disappointment or abandonment." Bethany's expression softened. "Your mother leaving, your brother going west, they hurt you deeply." "They did," Daniel acknowledged. "So I built walls. Told myself isolation was strength. Believed it was better not to need anyone. And now," the question hung between them, fragile and potent. "Now I realize what I really feared wasn't being abandoned," Daniel said, the truth revealing itself even as he spoke. "It was caring so much that losing someone would break me beyond repair. So I chose emptiness instead of risk." Bethany remained silent, waiting for him to continue, her eyes never leaving his face. "Then you arrived," Daniel went on, finding courage in her steady gaze. "With nothing but hope and determination. No pretense, no demands, just honest strength in the face of difficult circumstances. And something in me recognized something in you." He took a step closer. "These past months, having you at the ranch, it's like I'd been living in a world without color, and suddenly everything was vivid again. The house became a home. Meals became something to look forward to. Each day had purpose beyond mere survival." "I've felt it too," Bethany admitted softly. "A sense of belonging I haven't known since before my parents died. But you kept your distance. and when Matthew showed interest, you seemed almost relieved. Not relieved, Daniel corrected. Terrified. Because acknowledging what I feel means accepting vulnerability. It means admitting I need you in my life not as an employee, but as. He hesitated, then forced himself to complete the thought. As the woman I've fallen in love with. The words, once spoken, hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Bethany's eyes widened, hope and uncertainty warring in her expression. I have nothing to offer but a small ranch, hard work, and a heart that's out of practice at loving, Daniel continued. But if there's any chance you might feel something similar, Daniel, Bethany interrupted, stepping closer until barely a hand's breadth separated them. The day we met, when the storm forced us to your ranch, you said something I've never forgotten. I told you I had nothing but hope, and you said that was all you ever needed. Daniel nodded, remembering the moment with perfect clarity. Hope isn't nothing, Bethany continued. It's everything. Hope is what brought me west. Hope is what made me keep trying when logic said to give up. And hope is what made me stay at your ranch even when you seemed determined to keep me at arm's length. Hope for what? Daniel asked, barely daring to believe what her words implied. Hope that the man I was falling in love with might eventually see me as more than just his housekeeper. Bethany answered simply. That the connection I felt growing between us wasn't one-sided. That the walls you built could come down, given time. The world seemed to pause around them. The music from the square fading into background, the autumn night holding its breath. In Bethany's clear gaze, Daniel saw everything he'd been afraid to want. Companionship, understanding, a future shared rather than endured alone. What about Matthew? He asked, practical concerns intruding despite the moment. Bethany smiled gently. Matthew is a kind man, and I've enjoyed his company. But my heart has been elsewhere from the beginning. Relief flooded through Daniel, followed immediately by determination. No more hesitation, no more hiding behind walls of his own construction. Bethany O'Malley, he said, taking her hands in his. I've spent years believing the frontier takes more than it gives. That attachment is weakness. That a man stands alone out here, or he doesn't stand at all. He shook his head ruefully. I was wrong about all of it. The frontier gave me you. Loving you is the greatest strength I've ever known. And standing with you would make me a far better man than I could ever be alone. Bethany's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Are you asking something specific, Daniel Sutton? I am, he confirmed, surprising himself with the certainty he felt. I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife. Not my housekeeper, not my employee, my partner in everything. Building a life together at Sutton Ranch, facing whatever comes as one. Time stretched between them, the moment expanding to hold all possible futures. Then Bethany smiled, radiant and certain. Yes, she said simply. With all my heart, yes. The distance between them vanished as Daniel drew her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Around them, the celebration continued, but they had created their own private world, a sanctuary built not of walls and isolation, but of trust and shared hope. They returned to the festival hand in hand, facing Matthew's disappointment with gentle honesty and the community's surprise with quiet dignity. By evening's end, it was generally understood throughout Redemption Springs that Daniel Sutton was a changed man, and Bethany O'Malley was the reason why. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, a simple ceremony in the town church followed by a celebration at Sutton Ranch. Sheriff Miller stood as Daniel's best man, while Widow Carson, who had grown fond of Bethany during her brief stay, attended as matron of honor. That evening, as the last guests departed and twilight settled over the land, Daniel and Bethany stood on the porch of what was now truly their home. Happy? Daniel asked, his arm around his wife's waist. Bethany leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Completely. Are you? More than I ever thought possible, he admitted. For years I believed safety meant isolation, that needing someone meant weakness. And now, Daniel gazed out at the land that had once been his only companion, seeing it transformed by her presence. The ranch was no longer merely property to be defended. It was the foundation for a future they would build together. Now I understand what my father tried to tell me before he died, Daniel said softly. That the true wealth of the frontier isn't in the land or the cattle. It's in finding someone to share it with. Someone who sees the struggle and the beauty in equal measure and chooses to face it by your side. Bethany turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. Someone who arrives with nothing but hope? Daniel smiled, drawing her closer, and discovers that was all I ever needed. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they entered their home together, not as employer and employee, not as two solitary souls navigating a harsh frontier, but as husband and wife, partners in whatever the future might hold. The walls that had once protected emptiness now embraced fullness. The isolation that had masqueraded as strength gave way to the genuine power of shared devotion. In the years that followed, Sutton Ranch prospered under their combined care. The herd expanded, the house grew to accommodate children, and the community flourished around them. But the true miracle, as Daniel often reflected during quiet evenings with Bethany by his side, wasn't in the visible successes. It was in the transformation of a man who had believed himself destined for solitude, discovering instead that the greatest courage wasn't in standing alone against the frontier, but in opening his heart to love, even knowing its risks. In finding that vulnerability, far from being weakness, was the foundation of his greatest strength. And all it had taken was a woman who arrived with nothing but hope, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes that was everything.